Welcome, everybody. If you could please make your way to the seats, please pick up some food if you haven't already. I'm Chris Hoadley. I am the director of the UB Institute for Learning Sciences, and I am delighted to welcome our first speaker of the year, Dr. Wade Berger, recently of Northwestern University. Wade is a wonderful scholar who has come through a variety of different paths in education, starting out sort of on the formal side and then moving through museum education. Wade was part of a series of networks of digital media and learning youth programs that were funded by the MacArthur Foundation and helped architect makerspaces and activities at aquariums and other kinds of learning ecosystems that extended beyond school walls into the community and into various other areas. He's an expert on and is going to talk to us today about some really interesting ways of thinking about how learning happens in infrastructures and how those infrastructures extend beyond what we might think of as school policy or school reform or cognitive psychology of learning, and instead really zooming out and looking at the larger systems that learning and learning practices are embedded in. We're really delighted he was able to come for this visit. I will also say for those in the room, the attendance is full, so sorry I can't invite you to it, but Wade is also going to be holding a workshop after this with Push Buffalo, People United for Sustainable Housing in Buffalo. And this is part of UBILS's efforts to make sure that the scholarship that we are doing is engaged with the community. So as our guest speakers are coming, we're trying to encourage them to treat it a little bit more like a residency and to work with some of the wonderful people in Western New York that are doing work that's important to learning sciences. So I would like to have you join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Wade Berger.
Awesome. I think the microphone's on. Folks can hear me well. Great. Well, Chris, thanks for the introduction. As you said, my name's Wade Berger, and I'm going to present to you today. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Maybe I can put it a little further away from myself. Can you still hear in the back, though? Okay, I'll try to project too. So I'm going to present today a little bit of work that comes from a paper that I worked on with another scholar, Ronnie Hayden, who was a grad student recently at UC Boulder, but is now actually going to be doing a postdoc at NYU. And I'm actually going to extend this paper a little bit specifically for today and for the workshop that we're going to be doing with Push in a couple of different ways. And so I would love critique on the parts that I'm extending it, because those bits are quite raw and quite new based on kind of the framing that Chris and Ari and I have been talking about with urban planning. So when those parts come up, judge my amateur language on how I'm talking about urban planning. It's going to be great. Okay. So let's click. There we go. So I'm going to do this Venn diagram. Provides sort of an overview of the theoretical argument that I'm going to share with you today. And so at the top, we have infrastructuring, but this is learning sciences infrastructuring. I'm going to be really clear, even though on like the last slide I had a map, this part isn't quite about maps, but we're going to make it about maps. So we'll get there. But in infrastructuring and the learning sciences, we're talking about how we can push or how we can look at the routines or relationships and the socio-technical systems that enable or constrain learning over time and across places. Infrastructure research in the learning sciences asks us to pay attention to how these systems of learning are built, how they're maintained, how they're challenged, who works on them. And this work primarily focuses right now on learning in schools and school districts and school systems. But that brings us to the circle on the right here, which is learning ecosystems work. This research is typically framed around coordination and collaboration of learning across communities, usually focusing on access to opportunities, how opportunities are created. And this is often through systems level planning and partnership models. And that framing has shaped how folks start to think of a unit of analysis of the whole community. What's learning look like in the whole community? Learning sciences researchers have increasingly called for an increased focus on the part in between those two areas. For folks who were at the International Learning Sciences Conference a year ago, you got to see Nicole Pinkard do her keynote talk, in which she finished the talk by saying we needed a learning infrastructuring turn in the learning sciences, one that centers local realities and complexities of local ecosystems as we think about infrastructuring. So Ronnie and I have proposed an idea that sits between there, which is community-wide infrastructuring. And this originally stemmed from us wanting to do a literature review of infrastructuring and how it talked about communities. But what we actually found was, as we were looking at the literature, that we weren't seeing things that we saw on the ground as we were doing community partnerships, as we were working as grad students, trying to set up works, trying to find what communities wanted from the research that we were providing. And so we ended up creating this theoretical argument that I'm going to kind of show today about community-wide infrastructuring. And as a special edition for the talk today, we're going to do this community development piece. And I want to expand the community-wide infrastructuring work to think about urban planning, community development, and the folks who care about urban planning and community development as they design, as they work with hard infrastructure like streets and road and transit and all of those kinds of things. So today we're going to look at how all three of these areas come together in what I'm going to call learning-centered communities or learning-centered community design. And so for the talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about urban planning, but most of that's going to happen at the workshop later. So folks are coming to double dip on that. It's going to be great. So little theoretical background, because I know we have a lot of folks from different parts of learning, and we've got folks from planning. This comes from some branches of the learning sciences that Ronnie and I have worked in. I've been a postdoc with Nicole Pinkard's lab, so a lot of this comes from there as well. So we're, in theories of learning, this is largely shaped by socio-cultural, political frames of how learning is navigated and challenged. This also comes from folks who are studying learning in out of school settings. I'm pretty much for today shelving the learning in school part, which folks may know a lot about, but there's a lot fewer folks working on sort of these things in the out of school time. And then it's also largely shaped by how we think about design research in ways that empower community members to shape research, lead research, co-participate in research. I like to say that as a researcher, I just have a little bit more time than they do. When in reality, many of my partners in the projects I've worked on could have led the research that we're doing, and they just needed my time. So those frames there, and all of these sort of shape this theoretical argument that we're talking about. And because this is such a wide range of articles and ideas, I actually set up a share with all of the papers that Ronnie and I started with as we went out to write this paper. So that QR code goes to a website that's PaperPile. You're welcome to scan it. But I really want to call attention to, in the learning ecosystems work, this is a lot of what we're borrowing is from Marika and Kevin Crawley and the folks at Pittsburgh, who have basically decentralized an individual learner when they're thinking about a learning ecosystem. Again, the unit analysis being the whole community. How do we think about learning when we are not talking about individual outcomes for an individual kid? And then also in the infrastructuring work, which I'm going to get into this in quite a bit more detail, I wanted to note that our paper didn't actually have this citation quite yet because Nicole had just published this at the beginning of the year. But this is, Nicole and the Digital Youth Network team at Northwestern, they use a term called opportunity landscaping when they think about this work. And this paper is fascinating. It's about the ways that we need to have data set up so that we can do mapping, so that we can actually look at what a community is in the terms and the categories that people care about. And so that the maps aren't just we're not making a Google Maps of where all of the Boys and Girls Clubs are. This is about how to set up that mapping to be much more useful for folks. So all of that theory leads us to, this is our research question. The goal here is to understand infrastructuring on a community-wide scale, looking across learning ecosystems. Again, this is looking across institutions, looking at communities that have local and unique histories, and in everyday constraints of the community partnerships that we do for looking at learning. So let me dive into this. These three papers were the primary sort of theoretical arguments that we use and extended in this paper, and we found super helpful. The first paper by Bogdan Chen, this is an improv framework, and in it, this paper is amazing. This is like the literature review we actually set out to do around infrastructuring in general. It's a wonderful paper. I really recommend it for folks who are just starting out in the learning sciences, infrastructuring, research in general. But in it, Chen offers a strong review of infrastructuring work and proposes a model, improv, that looks at how we can sustain innovation by embedding it within local systems and acknowledging what's happening in the local system. And the second paper, this is a foundational paper in the infrastructure work. This is Starr's Ethnography of Infrastructure. It helps lay out how to study infrastructure relationally and ecologically. And Starr offers methods mainly for surfacing infrastructure that is invisible or unattended through ethnographic data collection, ethnographic attention. And then finally, we have Belichick's social infrastructure framework. Originally, this was written for classrooms, but it outlines 4 dimensions of infrastructure that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. Cultural beliefs and practices, socio-technical spatial relations, and interaction with the outside world. And these help us, really the focus here is attending to the hyper-local, hyper-specific realities of learning in a unique community. So what do I mean by, you've got that's a little bit on the infrastructuring that we're pulling in. So what do we mean by community-wide? Trying to, again, harmonize infrastructuring with theories around learning ecosystems and learning across spaces so that we can build a community-wide lens, which recognize collaborative approaches to learning research and learning design. So taking ideas from each of those 3 papers to an ecosystem level lens, and to do more than just plotting educational institutions and organizations on a map. I'm gonna propose 4 examples that sort of scaffold our investigation of community-wide and what that looks like, and I'm gonna show those through some diagrams here. So I know this is a long room, and so the diagrams are tiny, but I'm gonna talk through what the diagrams are, and I'm gonna say the things that are on here, so no worries if you cannot read the specific words. These are also fake diagrams. This is not a community anywhere. This is something that I've created as a hypothetical so that we can talk through it. I'm gonna give some examples so we can use them to think with. So with each idea, I'm gonna present 2 diagrams. One is based in one or more of the 3 pieces of literature that I've shared. And then a second that takes that idea and stretches it to a community-wide lens. I know these also look like social network diagrams with the arrows and that kind of thing, and like there's some value to that, but that's not what we're doing here exactly. But I am trying to show relational aspects between the elements within this particular ecosystem. And so, just generally, you've got things that are hard infrastructure like buildings and places and that kind of thing. We've got soft infrastructure, which is like a curriculum or the LMS platform that a school district uses and that kind of thing. That's an informational infrastructure. And then we've also got the key social actors that you see there. So again, but wait, what happened to this stuff? So as I explore each of these community-wide examples, I'm going to start to make use of some examples that are drawn from some of my work and some anecdotal sort of pieces. They're super heavily amateur in their uptake of community-level planning ideas. So this is the part where I want folks who think about planning, who think about urban design, to be like, those examples are okay, but like on the ground, we actually worry about this and this. Housing is this, and this to us, and politics of who gets to set the learning agenda is this, and this to us, right? So I'm hoping that through talking with you all, through the questions, and then through the workshop later, we can have better terminology, lenses, and frameworks from the community design world to sharpen where we might pursue other infrastructuring efforts based on the ideas that I have here. So with that, let's do the first example. So this comes from Chen's improv framework, which is about identifying key actors, especially those who use, implement, or are affected by learning innovation, learning changes to learning in a school district, in a school setting. It's central for Chen to enable sustainable change for learning in a school. This often means the teachers, the administrators, sometimes students, sometimes family, sometimes folks beyond the folks that are in the school every day. But you see on this slide, I've got those folks in the red circles. It's all the people you would expect. And the arrows, for me in this, show the relationships and interactions between these social actors and how those relationships might impact something that happens within a school or a change that's going to happen in the school. So this framing is super important, according to Chen, because it can help district leaders identify institutional bottlenecks. Maybe there's a relationship that isn't working. Maybe there's a person who's not connected here that needs to be in order to, like if the technology coordinator at the school isn't on here, the LMS isn't going to work if the teachers and the principal are the only ones trying to design it, right? So it's really about looking at who's left out, who's disconnected when we don't get the full picture of the key social actors in the school district. So simple diagram, community diagram. So again, I'm going to do this through pairs of diagrams. So this is the second one. This is the key social actors, but I'm going to expand this to community social actors. So the community level, obviously we can map a wider range of social actors because there are a lot more folks that are involved in, especially if we broaden what learning means and who are the learners and what learning is happening in community. So here we've got red circles that again just show the distributed set of social actors, from librarians to teaching artists to civic data analysts, all who interact with youth or other learners in a community. And then in a community, these roles often operate outside of actual formal institutions, or sometimes even outside of like someone's day-to-day job to work on learning in the community, but they still shape how youth move through learning spaces every day, even at one space, or if a learner is moving from the school to the after school to the sports team to whatever, right? And so for me, what this diagram makes visible is how people carry responsibility over learning in their community without formal design power. In community-wide infrastructuring, expanding the definition of social actors is pretty necessary to address equity. This challenges us to ask who gets to be counted as the designer of learning in a community, and what design tools are needed to coordinate actors who aren't based in formal institutions or for whom learning and shaping learning is not their job, right? So, next idea. This one comes from Starr's concept of surfacing invisible work. It also is seen in Chen's work looking at installed bases, which are like this taken for granted systems that constrain new design. So we're talking about making things that are happening in an ecosystem of learning visible that are actually having a huge influence on the system, but we don't know that they're there, right? In district settings, so in this diagram here, this typically involves surfacing the internal systems that shape how learning opportunities arise in classrooms before that you even get to the classroom. And so like in the example with the green arrows, and again, tiny text, but I'm going to talk about it. I'm kind of tracing here the informal coordination for student participation in an after-school club. So in order for the after-school club, the after-school science club to happen, you have to have permission slips. You have to have, maybe the after-school club wants to go on a field trip, and that's way more, it's all the kind of complicated things around transportation that the teacher or the after-school sponsor is going to have to coordinate. The snacks, how, if a kid's staying all day now and now they're after school, what happened to food if they're going to be there late? These are all elements that are not necessarily mapped in the diagram of what's happening or not necessarily mapped when we talk about what happened in the learning in this after-school club, but they're critical for that learning to take place. The kids, the snacks have to be there or the kids don't learn, we know, right? So in parallel, I've got another example here with blue arrows. This is an embedded routine. This is talking about professional training. And, professional training really requires, a lot of things. We know that there are different models of professional training for teachers and how teachers are available and can uptake what they learn in professional training. But that kind of training assumes that teachers have the time, capacity, and alignment with their work and their daily constraints to be able to uptake that training and for that training to get through to all the teachers and the folks in the district that want that to happen. I think the professional training world would argue that that folks are working on that. They're trying to acknowledge those constraints. They're trying to build trainings that that aren't one-off things and that kind of stuff. But those routines of a teacher and how they think about the training getting into their classroom are super important. We have to make those things visible so that the training designers can align to it, right? So by visualizing these hidden infrastructures, we can get school leaders and designers to recognize how those logistics shape access and inclusion to the learning in those schools. I wish that like these are just going to get progressively more and more and more and more complex. So I should have just made one that was just like the whole slide to take all the TVs. Anyway, so in communities, I feel like the invisibility problem is compounded. No one is sitting and looking at this system as a whole to think about what is being missed. People might be thinking about their own institution's biases or young people that they're not reaching because they're not in the right neighborhood or because they don't have the right transit options to get to their place. But rarely are folks sitting and thinking, how do teenagers to get to every museum in the city? Or how do teenagers do their bus passes so that they can go to the thing? Or what does the drop-off system look like so that someone can go from... In Chicago, one of the examples of this is that we don't know if young people are rarely going to school in their neighborhood. They're often majority of them are going to school in a different neighborhood. And we don't actually know where they want to have their out-of-school time at their school, on the way from home, or near their home, right? Because no one's looking at that as a whole because it's not the school's challenge. And it's also not the out-of-school time person's challenge as a whole, right? So these go unexamined because they're across organizations. So the example that's in blue here is how mentor development, like similar to teacher development, but it's spread across organizations, libraries, workshops, pop-ups, whomever. And, if a school might want to introduce a STEM curriculum, you might have a district person who's a curriculum coach. You might have a district person who's gonna, especially if they're adopting a curriculum, might try to package it and build it out. No one on the community-wide level is thinking about how does this idea about robotics get out to all of these organizations, to all of these educators, in ways so that they complement each other, right? Many folks are connected to a community-wide curriculum in that way, places that have done this, but we're unable to see who leads the professional training across those settings and across those staff. Because of this, mentor training and out-of-school time is very fragmented. It's difficult for communities to initiate shared curriculum or shared learning goals across programs and settings. And these community-level infrastructures aren't necessarily broken, but they're just uncoordinated. Without the coordination, access to STEM can then go unnoticed. And that leads really nicely to the next idea here, which is about paradoxes. Starr points out to infrastructure often breaking down, not from failure, but because incompatible assumptions happen about learning. Chen talked about paradoxes as well, emphasizing the need to anticipate tensions when they arise between existing structures and new designs. And so for this diagram, we're talking about a paradox in schools. And this is, I'm going to just keep doing the STEM curriculum idea. This is that a new STEM curriculum is introduced, but the implementation plan doesn't provide enough support for adapting it to like the local context, like what the uniqueness of that school. And so teachers want to tailor the content to their students, but the system doesn't accommodate that. The purple dashes show how like the principals, the teachers, and the training facilitators are all connected to the implementation of the STEM curriculum. However, we're left to ask, what connections make it possible for teachers to work on and solve the relevance they're seeking for the young people they're working with in ways that make it so they can push and pull the curriculum and the other folks who are shaping the curriculum, or like pushing the curriculum, in ways though they don't abandon the curriculum because they can't make it work for the specific and the relevant pieces that they want to change about that curriculum. So this is where the infrastructure of the relationships, the interactions, the trainings, all of that breaks down because that infrastructure is resistant to the change of the new curriculum, right? In the community, paradoxes show up when individual organizations don't get to consider, they're not able to consider, or they're choosing not to consider the broader context in which they are supporting STEM learning across the community. So in this example, the diagram, the arrows and the yellow side This is about schedules. I'm going to use a museum here. A museum might try to run a program that they think is inclusive. Like, I want to do this program. It's going to be specifically for kids with autism, and they're going to come, and we're going to have, for a person on staff who has autism, like really design this beautiful program, and we're going to run it at 3 p.m. But they might make assumptions about participation at 3 p.m. that makes it so that none of the young people they actually want to work with can show up to that program. An example in Chicago, most sports in Chicago now happen at like 7 p.m. because kids don't always do sports at the school, like I said before, but they're doing it somewhere else, and they allow for the transit time to get to that sport, which means that every sport's at 7 p.m. And so, like, if you want to do sports and you want to do robotics, you got to decide, am I going to slip robotics in before I go to the 7 p.m. thing? And probably not, right? And so assumptions about participation in the broader sort of community affect participation in an individual program. Things like availability of meals, transportation, et cetera. They prevent the kinds of participation that like that museum would actually want. In the purple section, you see this a little bit again, but this is about this, and this framing of timing is actually about competing for young people. So an individual organization is saying, I'm going to run my thing at 3 p.m. and I'm going to get all of the biology interested students from this school to come to my museum because we do marine biology. I work at the aquarium in Chicago. We're going to get them to come. But in reality, the timing there is actually a competition with the Field Museum, which is right next door, that also is running a program that kid is also interested, but it's not biology. They're excited about it because it's about, some other kind of research or some other kind of science that they're into. But because they're not thinking about, oh, we're doing this at the same time, they're actually competing for kids in ways that they don't need to compete, right? Those kids would gladly do both programs if they coordinated and set up, you run it at 3, we'll be at 3:30, we'll run this as one program, right? So again, I'm arguing that these issues have to be surfaced and negotiated in collective ways instead of, so that individual organizations are working with each other to solve them. And instead of seeing these as unfixable trade-offs, I'm hoping that we could use them to support shared decision-making of like, what should the schedule be for out-of-school time? How do the museums and sports play together, right? And then I'm going to finish with local heterogeneity and context. And this one, for me, is a foundation for all the rest, because this is about looking at I keep giving examples of Chicago, right? But Chicago is not like everywhere else, right? Not all communities have the kind of transit that we have. Not all communities have even the idea that kids go to school outside of their neighborhood, right? The local differences in communities are important for any of those other sort of framings of infrastructuring to happen, right? And so this is all from Belichick's framework. This is focused on the local, specific, and different about learning within a context. And so in our school district diagram here, I've got examples that are highlighted in green of 3 different kinds of communities that are doing learning at the school. So on the left side, you have, up here, we've got this youth-driven environmental justice project that a teacher is trying to run in their classroom. And that's quite different than a school that's got a historic building and they're trying to do something around the historic building with their students. And that's quite different than the school that has an on-site university classroom where the kids can take community college classes or whatever. And those are all based on local things in the community, because this youth environmental justice project isn't just any youth environmental justice project. It's actually one that is deeply embedded with the Latino STEM club at that school. And so those 2 groups work a ton together. And it's possible because that school's got an outdoor garden and they're doing it in the outdoor garden, right? And maybe that outdoor garden's not even at their school, but it's somewhere else in the community and they're like super invested in it, right? And that relies on them having the bilingual STEM instructor who can lead this activity with these groups, right? The on-site university classroom, they've got a liaison with the university that comes to their school. I love that Northwestern has this with the local high school and the local elementary school district, right? That can enable classes and research and projects to happen because they're doing that liaisoning. So like that school is set up in that way that's quite different than the other school, right? And then the other school, the historic building was actually a site of protests. And so they want to do something around that, and they have community elders that can make that happen. So again, within a same district, one school's practices, if we thought about this as a whole district, one school's practices are tied to all of these things. And for researchers and ecosystem leaders, we have to work on designing with and through these specific differences and uniquenesses, right? So if you imagine in the ways that schools can be different, and I already started leaning on community level things for this, right? Because I put the park and the university. I think this is my most complex diagram. This is community locality, right? When we put this at a community-wide lens, we're looking at locality and heterogeneity through multiple cultural beliefs about what learning is. We're looking at through many different kinds of partners that might be interested in working together or thinking that they're competing. And so in this example, I'm actually going to trace logics of what STEM is for and how that might actually be different for two parts of the community. So in the blue, we sort of have this is a Chicago example where we're about to have a huge quantum research employer. And they're super interested in STEM for workforce development, right? And so they're working a lot with local employers who have people who are in STEM jobs, have people who have workforce development programs, training programs that the young people in the community and adults can get working with them as a means to make this STEM or this quantum research explode, right? They get to partner with a STEM-focused magnet school. They might have a tech company's headquarters there that's going to be able to provide grants to do research projects at the school or to bring funding to have an after-school program that's at their headquarters, all of that kind of stuff, right? That looks really different than what I have here in purple, which is basically built a different part of the community that is based around a city history museum, right? And the city history museum actually partners a lot with this regional museum of Mexican art. They also know that they have the opportunity to work with a newly remodeled public housing computer lab, right? And for them, they've got a youth advisory board. And for them, STEM learning is about a civic practice tied to this community history, tied to environmental advocacy and place-based learning, right? I hope I didn't give preference to either of those two because the goal here isn't to declare a winner. I do have a preference, but the idea is if we're going to talk about community locality, community heterogeneity, we have to make both of these beliefs visible. We have to show that different parts of the community have different beliefs of what STEM learning is for, who it's for, and what the outcomes for those learners are going to be. If we only work on one vision, we only resource one vision. If we only look at one vision, we only design for one vision. And we end up designing for a single future of STEM, right, across a community. So for me, community-wide infrastructuring means holding multiple visions at once and asking whose future is being built. And by visualizing these divergent beliefs, we invite communities to engage in infrastructuring that's pluralistic and contested in a good way, right? But wait, one more time to the learning center community. So across these examples, I talked about hints of learning-centered communities shaped by stakeholders, teachers, teaching artists, librarians, elders, all kinds of folks. I talked about workforce development, professional development, out-of-school learning for jobs, out-of-school learning for activism. I talked about schedules, like the really, really mundane thing of getting the schedules right. And also talked about competing visions of STEM. For me, these are quite amateur, lay windows into urban planning and community planning. But I think we need to work with community and urban planning minded folks to think about how these ideas shape who's designing communities, who is crafting policy and how they're crafting policy and what visions are going into the crafting of policy. And then how do we do this in a way that forefronts human-centered life in the community and then learning-centered life within the community. So more to be done on that. I want to give you a little preview of what my non-academic brain is thinking about with this, because I love bike lanes and I think there's some bike-minded folks here. And every time we talk about this, I keep thinking about some criticisms that I've heard about bike lanes. So, there's this interesting debate among biking YouTubers that folks might have seen about bike lanes. And in this debate, there are some folks who really don't like bike lanes. And this is bikers. These are people who cycle that don't like bike lanes. And this branch of urbanists argue that when we put in bike lanes, we think we're centering people because now we've got a place for people to safely bike, right? But actually, and that we're making biking-friendly neighborhoods because you can get from your work to your home or wherever. But they argue that by doing that, we're actually making it so that we have better car infrastructure. We're making it so the cars can drive faster because they don't have to worry about bikes. We're making it so that cars can have wider roads because the bikes aren't sharing the road with them, they're off to the side, right? We're also making bike lanes that are for a certain type of biker. A commuting biker wants a bike lane that runs from their home to their work. But a biker who wants to go to multiple stops along the way, to their grocery store, to their house, to drop the kids off, that bike highway doesn't work for them because they're going to get run over by the guys in spandex who are speeding past them, right? It's built for that kind of biker. And I just give this example to say that, and these come from these ideas. This book, Curbing Traffic, is about making human-centered neighborhoods. It's amazing. These are both examples based in the Netherlands, by the way. So caveat to that. This is Not Just Bikes, which we're going to watch one of his videos at the workshop later today. But in both of these examples, there's no bike lanes. These are just human scale roads in which people can be in because the cars are out of the way, right? And I give this example to say, what are the bike lanes of what we're thinking about when we design for learning in communities? What are things that we're thinking we're doing that is like, oh, this is great for learning, but in actuality, we might be shaping learning to a specific way, or we might say learning is for certain folks, or we might actually be limiting learning because there's other goals or other things that are actually better benefited from the structures we're putting in place. So again, this is super, Wade YouTube wormhole idea about this, but I want to talk about it more because I think in general, at first, bike lanes impact learning, right? Like this idea, it doesn't, getting young people and getting learners to and from places is important for learning. So even on the surface, we got to talk about bike lanes for learning, right? And how bike lanes could better support learning in communities. But my point here is, what are the theoretical bike lanes about learning infrastructure? What are we unintentionally doing that prevents learning from across communities? So I think in order to do that, we need to have better methods for understanding what learning is looking like in communities at this community-wide scale. At ISLS, a couple of the folks from the Digital Youth Network and I did another talk where we talked about ethnographic methods, where we actually can look at finding out these details of a community that we're missing right now. Part of that work is an app that this is a PhD student at Northwestern, Perry Green's work, where she's having young people map their own learning stories. And it's ArcGIS based, and they're prompted, sort of like the social media app that used to tell you once a day you've got to prompt and respond to it. It's in that vein to talk about learning, but they talk about whatever they want. And the best part about this is that we're surfacing all kinds of things that are not happening at the places we said we're learning, for one, and also not the things that we said we're learning, right? And so they're getting to code themselves what's happening here. The other piece is, and this is just a sort of a scrubbed example of one of the social network analysis things we're doing too, about how are we looking at how all of these stakeholders and structures and things are connected to each other, and what are the weights and the influences on them. I used to say when I worked at the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago that the aquarium had undue influence on learning in Chicago because lots of people wanted to work with us because we had pretty stable set of funding and we had some pretty large projects. But we weren't always the best about thinking about learning in the community. We definitely had a lot to learn from the partners that we worked with, but and I have been a loud voice in a room. And so then, there's an undue influence there. So I think that social network analysis piece, looking at those connections. This is a map of people who are connected to the library at a community in Chicago. And like the broader picture of this is that there are like a bunch of organizations that aren't connected to them at all, right? And why do those connections happen? And why is the library important in that community? Because in other parts of Chicago, other neighborhoods, the library is not the center of the neighborhood. So I think there are more methods here. Another one, it's hard to show on a slide, and that I know appeals to Ari and other folks is there's ethnographic studies of how communities, interaction analysis studies about how community members talk about and make use of opportunity data and mapping data. Like, what's it look like when they talk about those things in decision-making conversations where they're saying, here's where we should make changes in our community based on some data that we've seen. What does that talk look like? How do people shape it? I just gave the example of me being a loud voice in a room. Like, does my loud voice impact the conversation? Does my positionality as a PhD researcher influence? What are those influences in dialogue, right? So we have to methodologically, we have to work on making sure that research projects are also actionable and co-owned with the community members. I talked about that a little bit earlier, but we have to do it in ways that they themselves can see, interpret, and reshape their infrastructures and their communities. So several other areas of future work, building tools that help community recognize and respond to these things. This is a big part of Nicole's work and the data that I talked about earlier. I think particularly we need to look at rural areas. I even hesitate to use urban planning in this because I've talked to some folks who've wanted the mapping work that we've done at Northwestern who are at rural, like Idaho, ecosystems and that kind of thing. And, the schedule thing, it doesn't work for them because there's only 2 program providers and the schedule thing isn't the challenge, right? So they have way different challenges and we have to figure out what that looks like for them and what infrastructuring means for wider regions, rural regions. And then I think we also have to center equity a little bit more explicitly, knowing the constraints of what we're dealing with right now, but that's really important for the pluralistic visions of learning. The goal of today is bringing us to the planning conversations, bring us to the planning folks so that we can use their tools, use their language to better shape what we're trying to do. So with that, we're going to start this work at the workshop this afternoon for those folks who are joining us. There's much more in the full paper on the theoretical adaptations of those 3 articles. And Ronnie and I are also always available to chat with folks more about where this work can go. So thanks for letting me present today and open up for questions.
And for the benefit of our recording, I'm going to ask that people who have questions, please do use a mic. It also helps people in the room here. Anybody have a place they want to kick it off with? Wade?
I'm very interested in this rural setting question because several months ago, I got a chance to actually go to a very, very rural area in Eastern Tennessee. So it's a very small town. They only have 600 people, 1 K-12 school, and no museums, no after-school clubs. I'm thinking about how can we start? How can we start building this learning infrastructure for those rural areas and benefit kids there?
Yeah, for sure. I've got that. Yeah.
Yep.
No worries. I think so. I think there's. I'm going to answer 2 things for rural areas, and I think it's a hugely important question. One is there are massive supports for rural STEM ecosystems. The STEM ecosystem, sort of like national initiative, there are lots of them that are rural areas, and so I know that there are folks who are looking for the ways of thinking about it. So it's super important for sure. But then I think, secondly, in talking with the folks from Idaho and another couple groups that were from some other places where they're not just rural but expansive, some of these things still applied. We were still talking about transportation, but they were talking about, oh, well, could we have a bus that actually takes folks from this school to this other school so that we could run the program at this other school on Tuesdays and then take those same kids and then swap on Wednesdays, right? So it still was transportation, but not at all like the bus passes are important because young people can't get to a program if they don't have a bus pass problem, right? But I also think a piece that's important for, I said 2, but I'm going to say 3 things for this is that, some of the work that we're doing with DYN on the data side, some of that is quite intense and gets expensive and we have to figure out ways to make it so that rural communities can get the funding or whatever to do that kind of work too. We also have to have means for them to kind of do this work in less expensive ways, because they, you know, again, many organizations are going to be collaborating to try to make this work. Because, you know, even in a rural area, not one organization may be thinking about it as a whole, right? So I think all three of those elements are super important. I think it's a big area for us to continue to work on.
Hi, there we go. So one big aspect that I see here is the adults in the room, right? It's so hard to find time and spaces for people to be connected, like the actual logistic organizers and adults, and also as learners themselves. And we see a lot of connections in your networks, but what is the part of the infrastructure for finding both time and places for the adults to meet? Like, how does that enter in here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it also, like, which adults? Because I've told a few of you all that I've got to meet already this example, but you know, some cases it's like there's an anchor organization who feels responsibility to do this for their neighborhood, and they have convening power because maybe people want to partner with them. They have a long history in the community, and they have the mechanisms to like get people to come together. But many communities, you know, that anchor organization isn't the solution, right? I think about Chris introduced me talking about Hive and the network that we used to have before. They had a mechanism of funding that required collaborative funding. And so people came to I'll say it this way, people came to Hive meetings when we had collaborative funding. People didn't come to Hive meetings after we didn't have collaborative funding, right? That convening power between an anchor organization or those mechanisms, we have to figure out what are those things that can convene people so that they came to the funding because they needed the funding for their everyday work, but they got to benefit from conversations about transportation because they were in the room, right? Or they got to go to the anchor organization because they needed that anchor organization's resources, but they got to meet the other people from the neighborhood in that room, right? So like delivering on the convening through what actually fits in their day-to-day, I think is super important, but also recognizing that like anyone who's doing convening has their own mission, their own objectives for bringing those folks together. And it may not be the objectives of the folks who are going to actually be influential or the young people for sure on what they want to see. And so we have to like de-emphasize their role. Like that anchor organization example, I've got a few in my head where like the anchor organization actually is competing with the people they're convening, right? And so they're not the best convener because they're going to ask folks to come and share, but they're still going to be they're funded for their programs. They're not always funded for the convening. So they're going to run their program even if it competes with the ideas of the people who got in the room, right? So I think it is about as much thinking about the ways that we get folks in the room, but like in the room and discussion in ways that actually feel close to why they want to talk about this stuff, why they want to see a change, right? I think I twisted your question a little bit for that, but yes.
I'll ask a question. You know, I think one thing that causes people to either disconnect or simplify, you know, thinking about your diagrams and how messy they get, how quickly, you know, is the idea that sometimes there are useful seams that can be created. For instance, you know, there's one infrastructure for formal in-school education and another for out of school. Or, you know, there might be one infrastructure within the Buffalo Public Schools school district boundaries and a different one in some of the surrounding suburban or rural school districts. And I guess one conundrum that I wonder whether you have ideas about or whether our planning colleagues have ideas about is where do those tensions or those seams create undesirable inefficiencies? I mean, when I think about like regional land use planning, I think there's been a lot of exploration of reasons that different governance units need to coordinate or assemble in order to articulate their infrastructures with each other. And I wonder if you have any ideas about the kind of, you know, top of line list of like where the critical places where we are failing to articulate infrastructures that really matter for the learning lives of especially kids, but could be adults too.
Yeah. there's a lot there. I think what's coming to mind right off the bat, and so you have to tell me, this is a good one for dialogue. I think funding structures can be a huge part of this, right? And I just give the tiny example of, like, we got funding at Northwestern for some of this community work solely because we have the capacity as a university to handle the dollar amount, right? The other partners that were submitting alongside of us, they were doing amazing work. I actually critique our work and say they were doing better work than us. But there was no way they were going to be able to do a 90-day remit on salaries, right? And so we have an HR department, we have a grants department at Northwestern that allows us, that is our infrastructure for funding, that is completely walled off from our partners unless we figure out ways to then like pass it along and that kind of thing. But just because we have it from the beginning, we're going to get said yes to before the individual partners are. And I think that's like an example of, like, you know, you could trace that off of grants, you could trace that off of city, that actually was from some city funding, right? That, you know, until that gets, that has to be investigated and figured out so that we can actually get the money to the individual organizations who are small who could do something with it. So I put funding as like the top one. That's an example. I also think that, like, another one in this is probably the, like, access to decision makers who have authority that some folks have, right? You know, this is looking at the different stakeholders, and they're the key social actors. Like, if you have someone in the mayor's office who works for this, you know, who's not the first person you actually have to contact when you submit a planning thing, but like their boss's boss's boss, that structure gets you to bypass and gets you to, you know, you get to have dialogue then about what you need to change in your proposal. Not everyone has that foot in the door to be able to do that. So I think it's like, I'll say those two because they're both things that enact power over a community, and they're deeply set in some structures that are set up, not necessarily for that power's purpose, but to, you know, not everyone gets to play in those systems in the same way.
Awesome. Hi, Wade. Thanks for a really great presentation. It is so rare that I'm in a room where people are like, planners might have the answer, because usually we do not have the answer. And so I want to jump off sort of what you were talking about with governance and financing, and I'm going to suggest a couple of works from our field in planning that might be helpful to think about. So first of all, this idea that we can have collective decision making is entirely what planning came out of, right? And so we have had a lot of faith in that, and how we did it. There was a really important book that came out in our field in the late 1990s about how even when we follow our technical guidance, even when we have these things in and we do plans that win international awards, they still fail. And they fail because of governance and financing. And so those are real barriers that we sort of know exist that we don't really always address in this collective decision-making visioning on what we want out of it. So I would point out to you Bent Fluberg's Rationality and Power, which is a fantastic book that sort of repositioned how planning was thinking about power in the technical processes that we were doing. So something to think about there. I think your bike example is the bane of my existence. I work on road infrastructure, and this idea that we can serve everyone with one infrastructure system is a lovely idea, but is just a complete fallacy. And so then how do we as policymakers decide who to serve and where to serve and how to deal with these conflicts? And this is where we look at communicative action is one of the theories that we've sort of brought in Habermas, but we don't do it well. And I actually think some of your tools in the learning sciences about sort of these interpersonal connections and power relationships are exactly what we need a little bit more in the design and planning fields to maybe help us think about like how we're engaging in communities. Let's see. Oh, the one more thing to sort of think about, multiple viewpoints coming in and trying to our planning techniques and the practices that we use, we've moved away from this sort of comprehensive planning, as we used to call it, to something that's called scenario planning. And it's intending to open up more of these contested areas and more of these conflicts in the planning process, instead of having a planning process that ends where everyone feels good and then we can't do anything with the plan. And so I think thinking about that scenario planning, thinking about Fluberg's Rationality and Power and some of the work there could be a really good entry to bring some of your tools and frameworks into planning and could help us solve some problems we have in the design fields. So,
Love it.
I don't have a question.
No, I love it. This is why I came. When they asked, I was like, can you give me stuff? So this is wonderful. And I really appreciate your critique of like the universality of the bike lane sort of example, because even those Netherlands neighborhoods, it's not bike friendly everywhere, right? Like it's bike friendly in the places that are dense and where folks are doing sort of like the little short trips, but it's not bike friendly out. I mean, they try, but it's not bike friendly out in the industrial parts of town because that's not what's being done there, right? And so like, yeah.
Say too on that front, it's not necessarily the biking infrastructure, it's the problem, it's the culture around shared urban space, right? And who gets to use the road. And Peter Norton's work on this, looking at how streets transition from public spaces where there was more contested work to these single uses, would be something really important, I think, to think about there too.
Yeah. The recording has those all, I think. Yeah. Sure.
Other reactions or sparks flying?
Thank you, Wade. I'm just wondering if you or does anyone in the room have like positive examples of places that have managed to establish learner-centered communities or some hint of that, so we have some vision of what we should be working towards?
Anybody want to share from the group?
I mean, I don't know to what extent it was successful, but I know at one point Vietnam had a national program that they were attempting to, propel a 21st century economy, a digital economy, and it was conceived of as an infrastructuring project at a national scale. So there was a lot of discussion about not only education sector but workforce sector, also public policy and how to consider what infrastructural changes needed to be modified. I would also, I mean, I don't think we're at a success stage yet, but I would also point out within Western New York, we have this nonprofit organization called Tech Buffalo, which has been trying to consider, a regional human capital building program of learning for high-tech positions, high-tech innovation that then dovetails with like our entrepreneurial 43 North incubator and the state Empire AI investments and other kinds. I mean, it's a case where a location is becoming a nexus for different kinds of stakeholder groups to do infrastructuring from their own agendas. But I don't hold it up as like a shining example of success because I think it's just beginning. And I do think, I would suspect that everybody's seen glimmers of different kinds of examples, and I would love to hear as many as people have. We are running low on time, so maybe that can be our closing.
That's
here.
the goal. So yeah.
Does anyone have another sort of example, a positive example they would love to put out there? Or
we may as well mention Open Buffalo, right? So they've been doing lots of work in just training and organizing and networking lots of adults and professionals, and also helping them get jobs afterwards, which is, I imagine, a big part of that. But they're also doing ecological work in the communities and trying to make composting more accessible and have ecological sustainability educational programming. They're building like a big building nearby. So it is like largely the east side of Buffalo, parts of the rest of Buffalo. And it's relatively small, but it has a lot of fingers and a lot of different pies. And, it's still a work in progress.
Yeah. And that, I mean, one thing that I always admire Open Buffalo for is a focus on learning and leadership. So it's not like kids and STEM careers. It's like grown-ups and change agency, elders. Yeah.
Cool.
Very cool. Well, I want to appreciate everybody for coming and spending time here at this event. If you haven't, please do. Lindsay Gelson will be grateful if you sign up on the sign-up sheets, because that is how we tell UB that it was okay for us to order lunch. And also, it helps us put you on the mailing list for future notifications about talks and other kinds of interactive events. Wade's trip to Push Buffalo is just the beginning, so we're going to have a lot of other stuff that isn't just a talk on campus. I will also say, just in case anybody is not aware, the UBILS is hosted in the Graduate School of Education, which will be moving to South Campus in October. We're still planning on having all of our events here on North Campus through the fall, but they will probably be mixed up between the campuses come spring. And so please don't be afraid. The Stampede bus is quite usable. It's also parking on South Campus is not bad. And I hope that people who are coming to North Campus will be willing to also come to South Campus for our future events. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all. Good to see you.